Well, you might say that certainly most right-thinking American businessmen would be appropriately horrified at the idea of a confiscatory communist regime coming in and putting their ilk out of business. On the other hand, there were those who saw a potential opportunity in this. Very often, if you look at historical events, you'll find that the actual facts are so few or so basic or so vague that it's basically possible to build any kind of story around them. Often, where conspiracy theorists go awry isn't theorizing that conspiracies exist, they most certainly do, but often giving them too much credit for being too well organized and having these things in control. Maybe the most influential factor in history is the law of unintended consequences.
Hello, everyone. That was the voice of today's guest, history professor Richard Spence. Professor Spence is the author of Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. I invited him on to help me sift through the realities and fantasies of the different claims made for the United States backing the Bolsheviks. As you heard in the clips, Professor Spence also discusses how the ambiguities of history can give rise to a proliferation of interpretations, and what conspiracy theorists tend to get right and wrong. I start out by asking how he went into this particular area of research.
Well, I always get this question as to how I got interested in the various, unseemly things that I'm interested in. How did you get interested in the stuff that you're interested in? And the usual answer I give to that is that, well, one thing leads to another. You're interested in subject A, and subject A leads you to subject B and C and so on. And so basically, by sort of general academic training, I am a modern Russian and Eastern European historian. That's where my interest lies. So, the Russian Revolution is kind of smack dab in the middle of that. So it would be impossible to avoid. But in terms of in terms of modern Russian history, you're certainly interested in things like, well, politics, that's a huge part of it, diplomacy, and economics. Those are usually the big three, and often in that kind of order. So interest in the Russian Revolution then led me to an interest. Well, I can give you a specific example. The first book I wrote, which I had actually wanted to be my dissertation, but my advisors thought that it was, well, just too obscure of a subject, was on a little-known Russian revolutionary figure, quite a name in his day, but largely forgotten since, by the name of Boris Savinkov. And so my first book was Boris Savinkov, Renegade on the Left. And it was basically an effort, I'd say, looking at it again after some years, I have a pretty decent one, of trying to take Savinkov out of the obscurity that he'd fallen into, and at least reassessing or looking at his role in the revolutionary movement, both before 1917, during, and after, up until the early 1920s. So one of the things I ran across in the case of Savinkov was, one, a fairly significant figure who had, for all practical purposes, just been edited out of virtually any kind of commentary about the revolution. It was as if he was never there, and yet he was there, and he did play a personal role in decision making. He made decisions which affected events around him. And to give an example of that, Savinkov was a fairly high, he was like the number 2 military figure in the Russian provisional government, which was that sort of brief, sort of quasi-socialist dominated regime between the fall of the Tsar and the advent of the Bolsheviks. The government actually that the Bolsheviks overthrew, not the Tsar. And Savinkov was kind of political intriguer, vice minister for war, influential among the Cossacks and others. And when the Bolshevik coup d'etat is underway in October 1917, or November by the current calendar, and they're marshaling forces to take over the Winter Palace, one of the things that Savinkov gets a call from is from the fellow who was the head of the Cossack garrison near the Winter Palace, the one group of sort of actual experienced military troops who might have been able to hold the building, or at least forestall the seizure of the Winter Palace. And they basically wake him up and and ask him, "What do we do? Do we resist or do we not?" And he basically told them to sort of do nothing, and then went back to bed. Okay. And now, it's not to say that had Boris Savinkov given orders to the Cossacks at the Winter Palace to resist, that they would have done it. You don't even know whether they would have followed those orders. But the one thing he did by his action was to basically ensure that they would do nothing. Um, so I found it interesting that Savinkov, and the reasons that he was, let's say, written out of history for the most part, or only given a very minor mention every now and then when you couldn't possibly avoid him, was that he was one of those people who bit every hand that fed him. He was not a trustworthy man. He was extremely ambitious, kind of, one of those people who's always involved in some sort of plot, and maybe ultimately not very good at plotting. And so he managed to offend everyone, and thus sort of disappeared from the historical narrative. And that's another thing that I would bring up. I mentioned that the historical narrative, history is, after all, a story. Napoleon said it basically that it was a set of lies agreed upon, which is essentially true. Now, that's a weird thing to hear from a professional historian, but it's all pretty on sort of shaky ground, because what history, the sort of accumulated knowledge of the human past that we have, is really based upon two things. It's based upon a relatively small number of facts. And those facts, remember, are things that are, undeniably true. So we could say that, yes, there certainly was. Well, was there a Russian Revolution? Well, we could say, yeah, there was. There were actually sort of two in 1970, but yes, there was this whole revolutionary process. We can't deny that happened. But then when you get into questions as to why it happened, or how it happened, or who played this role, or what was more influential here, well, then you get out of the realm of facts and you get into the realm of opinion, or into narrative creation. So you've got these sort of, this relatively small set of facts, and what historians and others do is that we do the same thing with everything else. We come up with a story to explain these things. And that story can be, it can be true, and that it's very close to what happened. It can be completely false. It can be it's something which is made up, which bears no relation to what actually happened, even if the facts can conform to it. And but usually what you get is some mixture of the two. And it's, a narrative about the Russian Revolution that doesn't really include the role of Boris Savinkov, truly among a lot of others, isn't a complete narrative. It's a narrative which leaves certain characters out because they become inconvenient. So that was the first thing I discovered about Savinkov in investigating him. The other thing I came across was something that I'd paid no particular attention to, was that he was a Freemason. And a lot of the other political figures that he came in contact with were members of that fraternity. And I don't want to get into this whole thing about, this isn't because, Freemasonry is the work of the devil, as evil as anything else, they're all plotting to take over the world. No, nothing of that kind. I don't think they could manage to do that. But what it does create is it is a secret society. It is a connecting influence among people that often transcends politics. It's something that joins people together in a not very obvious way that can have important influences on their actions. It is an association of particular people who have sort of volunteered to become part of this association. So look, anytime you find out that everybody involved in something all belong to the same club, that's not accidental. It may simply be an artifact of other things, but it's not just one of those things. It is a consequence of other things around it. And I found out that relationship, his role as a Freemason, did influence how Savinkov dealt with people. So at one point, during the sort of events of 1917, when he's a position in authority, he's approached by one of the Romanov Grand Dukes, and I'm going to think it's Alexander Mihailovich, but I won't swear to that, but it's one of the imperial family. And they're basically trapped. They're sort of semi-prisoners in this town. And the Grand Duke comes to Savinkov and he asks him, he sort of admits that, look, we have really nothing politically in common, but I'm asking you as a brother Freemason to assist me and my family in getting out of this town. And Savinkov does. He puts politics aside and he assists his fraternal brother in escaping the predicament he was in. So there are lots of things that went on with this fellow. So once you begin to look at things like secret societies, then you begin to notice that they're sort of everywhere, that all kinds of people belong to them. And then you begin to look at other kind of associations. And I say that then drew me into an interest as to how people associated with occult organizations and the occult itself, people like Aleister Crowley, become connected with clandestine affairs and intelligence. It was one of those things that first seemed, it seemed unlikely. And then the more you look at it, the more you can see how it actually fits together amazingly well. So one thing sort of led to another. And it's in the process of that, if you take my interest in Russian history, the Russian Revolution, people like Savinkov, that's how I also came into contact with another figure who sort of haunted me. Okay, the one sort of figure that in some ways I wish I'd never come across just because he's so damn mysterious is the guy known as Sidney Riley. And we may get into more about him. So Savinkov, by the way, was a colleague, a co-conspirator with Riley. Their careers intersect. So it was Savinkov that led me to Riley. And then it was Riley who kind of led me to so much of the rest of these things, because Riley is, he's not James Bond. He's an international crook. He's essentially a con man. And maybe we can explain more about that. Also, a businessman. This is one of the things that people often overlook about him. That's all of his involvement in clandestine or espionage affairs are all under the cover of business. He's always running some kind of business. So Savinkov takes me to Riley. Riley takes me to a whole legion of other people whose careers and activities intersect in mysterious ways. And then I guess it comes into, what maybe is the real answer as to why these things interest me is that I love a mystery. All right. I like puzzles. I don't like things that are too obvious. I kind of like, people to be difficult too. I mean, it's one of the things that my wife noted is that if you're dealing with Riley, even to some degree Savinkov, most of the people that I tend to investigate are pretty much pathological liars. That is, they just lie. They make up all sorts of things about themselves, and in many ways, their lives are this, carefully created or not so carefully created fiction. And that's kind of a fascinating thing in a way. How do you actually piece together the biography of someone who is an inveterate liar? And well, you have to do it very, very carefully. And you also have to accept that in some cases that there probably will be parts that you'll never really know. I mean, you're left with this evidence that, again, you're going to have to weave into some kind of narrative. You're going to have to make some kind of biographical narrative about this. In a lot of ways, you have to admit that you can never be entirely certain about some of it. So that's how I basically got into this. So there we go.
So I'm just going to bring up my notes and to jump in on this point you made about mystery. And I have to say that the reason I got in contact with you, Professor Spence, is because the Russian Revolution, I like a mystery, but the Russian Revolution is a mystery that's beaten me. Okay, so one of the things, I put to you in the email was this contrast of narratives we had about it. So I quite like the anti-imperialist writer William Blum. He's kind of left of center, and he starts off his book talking about America, the United States, the CIA's anti-communist crusade, saying that really Russia was the template for this, and American troops went in intending to strangle at its birth the Bolshevik state. And they were so alarmed and offended by it because one, because they withdrew Russia from the war, but more than this, because the Bolsheviks had the audacity to overthrow a capitalist system, a feudal system, and proclaim a socialist state. This is totally, totally unacceptable to the American business class. And the Pentagon saw this as an honorable dealing to help people struggling for liberty. And the barons of American capital, you write, had no reason for the war against communism other than the threat to their wealth and privilege. Also, that's one narrative, okay, and I think that's not an uncommon narrative, okay. Maybe the moral indignation, maybe the left of sentiment, as William Blum brings to it, is maybe not pervasive. But then, if I pick up Anthony Sutton's work, I learn that actually the Bolsheviks could not have come to power without support from the United States and Britain. And he acknowledges this is exactly what the history books tell you didn't happen, that the Americans were occupying the Trans-Siberian Railway to keep the Japanese out, but that's all nonsense. They were there to let the Bolsheviks in. And in this, apparently the Bolsheviks were quoted in the New York Times thanking American troops in 1919 for this service. And Sutton is emphatic. We went in to help the Bolsheviks. There's no question about that. So what we have is two completely contrasting views. Now, yes. How do I begin to reconcile that? That people are looking at this event and seeing the complete opposite thing.
Well, if you're looking at the event and you get two different stories, two different narratives that are, mutually exclusive, they can't both be true. But again, the thing is they can both sort of, they can weave the known facts into it, or a selection of facts. They can also sort of leave things out. But very often, if you look at historical events, you'll find that the actual facts are so few, or so basic, or so vague, that it's basically possible to build any kind of story around them. Now, there's a lot of things going on in the Russian Revolution. This is a case of where you don't lack for information. In many ways, you're kind of overwhelmed by it because you have all of these different factional disputes. And so the first thing I come up with is that it's in both Sutton's and I think in Blunt's work, the idea is that essentially all of the vast majority of American capitalists are behaving and thinking exactly the same way. They're an undifferentiated mass. In the same way that we talk about things like the American government, the French government, the British government, as if this is a kind of collective, and it's an institution, but within that, what you have is factionalism. Okay, human beings are divided into cliques and factions, and therefore the US government, the British government at any given time is never composed of simply of one faction, or you can think of them as power groups. It can be everything from fairly large groups of people united around some particular point or common cause. It can be a particularly ambitious individual and their followers, but there's always factions. There are always differences of opinion. At no point in time, it would be extremely difficult to find any government at any point in time where everybody involved in decision-making within that government all agreed on everything. They might have to go along with something, but they wouldn't necessarily agree with it. And this is, it's one of those principles, I can't remember where it's one of those little observations that the fellow I was talking about before, the mysterious Sidney Riley, who, of course, as we'll see, wasn't even really Sidney Riley, came up with, is that when you're talking about governments, you're just talking about a selection of individuals. And if you can sway or eliminate certain individuals, you can change the policy of a government. That is, if you change the balance of power between the individuals and factions that are part of it. And if you think about it, in some ways, that's really a key to sort of modern politics in many ways. You just have to alter the balance of power within this system in order to manipulate it or to control it. So there was a difference of opinion, and I think in both cases it's an oversimplification of something which was a very fluid and in many ways kind of chaotic system. And I think this is another thing that it gets into the realm. Clearly a lot of the things that I'm interested in sort of seem to inevitably involve that very tricky area that is usually called disparagingly conspiracy theory. And this is, of course, generally connected to the idea that there are conspiracies, that there are deliberate plots of some kind that are behind most things. And, really, I'd argue that, yeah, that's absolutely true. Human beings conspire by nature and they conspire about everything all the time. It is just the way people operate. But the other thing is that most conspiracies aren't terribly well put together and don't really work. And it's the thing that often drives it isn't the idea that any kind of particular plot or scheme or stratagem, so those are all sort of the same thing. All of them are attempts to try to sway events, but they almost never work out the way people assume that they would. And part of that is, I think a big part of it is what I've always loved this. I always tried to get this across in history courses, and by saying that maybe the single most influential factor in history is the law of unintended consequences. And that means that when you set out to change one thing, when you try to alter a variable, when, for instance, let's say you overthrow a government or assassinate someone or back this faction as opposed to another one, well, you have an end result that you want in doing that. But what one cannot fully anticipate, or what is very rarely done, is that when you tinker with one variable, when you change one thing, you change a whole variety of other things. And therefore, you never quite get the outcome that you wanted. The law of unintended consequences arises from that action, which sort of screws with your whole wonderful conspiracy, which was supposed to make this work. So there were, I came to Sutton's book because he was addressing questions that had sort of arisen in my mind. And one of the things I'll say about his book, particularly his Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, and then his other ones, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, and I think Roosevelt and the rise of, Wall Street and the rise of FDR. In all of those, he really began to, I think, look at a variety of sort of real plots or schemes that were underway that didn't necessarily attain their goals, but he was talking about a phenomenon that was essentially real. But I think the limitations of his work written in the 1970s is that he had relatively little information to go on, and therefore he was inclined to accept whatever sort of came his way, and again, particularly to accept those things that conformed to the narrative that he was building. And I'll give you an example of that. He mentions at some point in Wall Street in the Bolshevik Revolution about Leon Trotsky being in America in early 1917, which he was. There he was. And I've written a couple of, I wrote about that in the book, my book, Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. And I've also written a couple of independent articles about that. It goes into in some detail. And yeah, it's like conspiracy a go-go with Trotsky from all different directions in New York in early 1917. But one of the things that Sutton mentions and takes at face value is a statement that appears in a book which states that when Trotsky left the United States, he left with an American passport. And furthermore, this passport had been sort of personally provided or ordered to be given to him by none other than President Woodrow Wilson. Now, that's a very interesting statement. And I wanted to know, now, is that true? And first I looked up the source of the information itself, which I won't go into all of it, but it's simply a statement without any kind of source or notation from it in a book by someone who I cannot see by any stretch of the imagination would know. That just seems to be, and in many ways, it's an assumption on their part that doesn't have any basis in reality. But it's an interesting. Another one is that Trotsky, when he was in New York, earned money as a film extra. That he that he actually had a part in a film in which he played, guess what, a Russian revolutionary. And now that's a story, by the way, that I absolutely loved. And I would like nothing more for that to be true. I was really rooting for that one because that would have been sort of the coolest thing ever. But then again, it doesn't. Sometimes you begin to look, and if you begin to look closely, I mean, if you look at the name of the film he supposedly played a part in, that film was made before he ever showed up. He couldn't have been in the film. There's nothing. So it was, again, it's a statement that someone makes later that shows up in a newspaper that someone else repeats. That again is a huge thing in history. One person says it, somebody else repeats it, someone else repeats it, and you repeat it enough, it then becomes perceived wisdom. When in really it was just someone making something up.
Can I interject here with
Yes.
a specific question on Sutton and some observations I've made, and you
Yeah.
can tell me whether you think I'm in the right ballpark or not. So just first to say, what I'd like to go on to do, I've got notes from your work about John Stevens and what was going on in Vladivostok and so on, which I'd like to contrast Sutton's position with your own. But the reason I think it's important to talk about and understand Anthony Sutton is, whilst he's probably not been as influential as he should be in the world and in history in general, he is massively influential in alternative media and what we call conspiracy media. And I don't mean that as a pejorative. I just mean people who take a slightly more conspiratorial view on reality. And a lot of people who are certainly consuming that, and maybe people even producing it, probably haven't read Sutton in any great depth, maybe, but they've listened to podcasts on him, and they go around casually accepting this idea that the United States was all behind bringing the Bolsheviks in. And that then slots, it doesn't end there, that slots into a certain reasoning for that. It's all to do with Cecil Rose's plan to reunite the Anglo-American establishment and bring about this one world government that's socialist in nature. And it fits in sort of somewhat uncritically into that worldview, I think. And Sutton himself, I listened to a talk he gave in 1987. Okay, and I just made some notes of some of the things that he said, which I think portray a certain worldview that I would think of it as like a John Birch Society worldview. Okay, now might not be nuanced enough there. I might be getting something a bit wrong, but he says things like he believes that the USSR at the time was using weather modification weapons to mess with the US space program, and they were the reason that the Challenger shuttle exploded. And he believes that the withdrawal from Afghanistan, this is 1987, is a complete fake. The Russians aren't going to really withdraw. He thinks that Russia is going to grow to be this great world power and have a war with the United States sometime in the 2000s. And he thinks that the United States is supporting or brought to power the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Now, I think I know what he's referring to there, but to say that in 1987, when Ronald Reagan is clearly backing the Contras all the way, it seems to be that Sutton has a particular worldview, and also because he's a big fan of Richard Pearl, that became more famous as a neocon in connection to the Iraq War, because Richard Pearl is very anti-Soviet. And I know it's been speculated that the John Birch Society occasionally was either fed or picked up upon CIA anti-communist propaganda and republished it, like with the getting rid of what's his name in Chile and bringing in Augusto Pinochet in.
Allende,
Allende, yeah. And I think that's the kind. I find the John Birch Society kind of interesting, and it gets me to think in a different perspective. But I do think sometimes they were publishing CIA anti-communist propaganda, and I do wonder if two questions really. One, Sutton is interpreting the very accurate and novel things he's seeing about US involvement from a certain paradigm that's colouring his view, and whether he was ever maybe being fed certain information by figures like Pearl or someone beneath that to do with building up this kind of anti-communist, anti-Russian position in the United States.
Well, we've been talking about narratives and the creation of narratives, and the other term that goes along with that is to control the narrative. And one of the things the good old CIA and any sort of intelligence security agency is interested in doing is influencing and, if possible, controlling the narrative about certain things. CIA was never shy from its inception and right through today of cultivating contacts in the media. This was what you needed to have. One of the things you wanted to have friends that could give you good PR, who could say good things about you, or could spike stories that were against you. This was the manipulation of information is always been part of this game. So it comes into the question: could, let's say, well, let's just say the CIA. We don't have to. It doesn't always have to be them, but let's say, could someone in the CIA have decided that the John Birch Society, now the John Birch Society was generally seen as one of those things which is called a far right organization. I always love these terms because that somehow implies there's a near right organization, or that there's a right organ. Anyway, what do you mean when you use the term far right? Is you're attempting to discredit it, because far means out of the mainstream, something which is unacceptable. And so the John Birch Society, I think they were, the more mainstream American conservatives would sometimes agree with them, put up with it, but they always just thought that they were, off on some tangent in many ways. And in some ways they were. Here's an interesting thing that I was reminded of. I think I'd noted at one time, but forgotten it, is that during the 1960s, during the era of the Vietnam War, the John Birch Society was quite adamantly opposed to the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. They opposed American escalation to Vietnam. Now, it wasn't because they wanted to, they wanted the Viet Cong to win, or wanted a communist Southeast Asia, but they believed that communism was a much greater threat domestically, that communism should be fought at home as opposed to focusing our attention on fighting it in Southeast Asia. So they thought it was a distraction. It was something that was drawing the national attention and energy away, where the real threat of communism, was in our schools and in society as a whole. But the John Birch Society was, I think, even by most mainstream conservatives, seen as slightly, wacko, a little bit out there. Their views were extreme. And nevertheless, they appealed to a certain constituency because there was a market for those so-called extreme views. It wasn't just 12 people somewhere who believed in that. It could influence hundreds of thousands of people. So even if you've got, let's say, a group that you don't necessarily agree with or approve of, the point is you recognize the fact that they have influences in certain quarters, and thus it might be useful to try to steer them in a particular, to use them as a vehicle for certain information you wanted to get across, particularly if that information otherwise might sound a little, far right. So maybe you wanted to put something out there, and you would have something like the Birchers, who would, eagerly glom onto that and advertise it. In the same way, you've got a researcher like Anthony Sutton, and Sutton was I think the thing that probably had the greatest influence on him was his work as a researcher for the Hoover Institution, which is a private research historical institution housed in Stanford University. And it's, of course, all the work of Herbert Hoover, American politician, president, and Russophile. So the Hoover Institution is a huge repository of information about the Revolutionary era and anything connected with that, because Hoover decided that it was going to be the repository, and everything was going to be contained there, essentially in private hands. Is a kind of interesting thing to note. He was very interested in maintaining control of information about the revolution as a way, arguably, of being ultimately able to shape the whole public narrative about that. And so the Hoover Institution would sponsor publications and bring in particular authors, make information available to them to kind of write the history that, in some ways, you could argue they wanted. And that's the sort of milieu that Sutton found himself in. And given access, as he was given access to the records he found there, that's where he first began to notice that the standard historical narrative didn't seem to fit. And basically what he came across was something that anybody who looked for it should come across, was that there were people, well, you might say that certainly most, let's say, right-thinking American businessmen or businessmen anywhere would be appropriately horrified at the idea of a confiscatory communist regime coming in and putting their ilk out of business. On the other hand, there were those who saw a potential opportunity in this, and also in some ways were even sympathetic to its overall goals. So all you have to do is to really go back and look at the newspapers of the time, look at what appeared in the American press in 1917, 1918, the years following that. And there you'll find people, like to give the two important examples, Raymond Robbins, and you'll also find William Boyce Thompson. Those were two, certainly William Boyce Thompson was a major figure on Wall Street. You've also got Charles Crane, who also thought that he was somehow God's gift to Russian affairs, who had a deep personal interest in it. And these were men who were very influential in American business. They were major figures in what we would call the Wall Street nexus. And yet, to one degree or another, they were not opposed to the idea of a revolution in Russia, the overthrow of the Tsarist regime. And then it just depended how far they wanted to go with it. So Charles Crane definitely wanted to get rid of Tsar Nicky and was willing to lend whatever assistance he could for that to happen. But he didn't necessarily want things to go as far as Lenin and company. Or on the other hand, William Boyce Thompson and Raymond Robbins thought that Lenin and Trotsky were just fine. That this was really the whole sort of wave of the future. This was, they were sort of Christ. This was sort of like the second coming in some ways, and they're not shy about saying this. You can find I've in my book. In Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, I can give you chapter and verse of the newspaper articles where William Boyce Thompson basically hails the Bolsheviks as true, authentic Democrats, and they kind of, real sort of grassroots American tradition, and that they were going to usher in a new age. And at the same time, he's also very eager to do business with them. So there again, one always has to look at this and argue how much of the pro-Bolshevik statements from someone like Thompson were really based upon true ideological convictions on his part, or simply a means of using ideological rhetoric to justify his ideas that he can make a lot of money off of dealing business with these guys. And then you have another figure who was very important in who did both, business with the Reds from the beginning, and that's Henry Ford. Now, Henry Ford had no particular interest. Certainly, Henry Ford was no commie. I don't think he can be accused of that. There are many things he can be accused of, but you cannot turn Henry Ford into a communist or pro-communist. What he was a businessman, pure and simple, in that regard. And the point is that there were trucks and tractors to be sold to Russia, and regardless of what sort of government was in power, so long as he got paid for that or got a license agreement, then he was perfectly happy. That simply was practical business to him. The other thing that I think influences this is that the Soviet regime that's created, the Bolshevik regime, let's call it that, let's stick to that term, that comes in the late 1917, was something really new. I mean, it was the first avowedly socialist regime on earth. Okay, never before. I mean, there had been peaceful and less peaceful and violent socialist movements. There have been, evolutionary and revolutionary socialist movements in European world affairs since the middle of the 19th century. So it wasn't exactly new. There had been, the First International, the Second International. We're working our way up into the Bolsheviks to the Third International. It was indeed a large, millions and millions strong international movement represented by many different parties. And remember, one of the things that the Bolsheviks would seek to do, one of the things that their brand of communism would sought to do, was to bring all of this under their control. That anyone interested in social revolution would therefore have to accept communist leadership in order to achieve this kind of world socialist republic. But there hadn't been, socialists haven't really had power anywhere, at least on a national level. So no one really knew what they would do. I mean, people talk about all kinds of things, but are they really going to do that? So, and I was seeing there were American businessmen in Russia who, when early in after the Bolsheviks come to power, the question was, well, they talk like they're going to nationalize everything, but remember, they didn't do that immediately. That was a kind of gradual process. Banks were nationalized, but businesses, foreign properties are nationalized over a period of time. And there were those who would argue that no, this is never going to happen because it's just too impractical. They can't do that. They're not going to abolish money because hell, who can do that and live? And yet, as these things unfolded, the narrative changed as well. But part of it is that you didn't know exactly what they were going to do. Their policies were not entirely clear. And another example of that is the Bolshevik declaration beginning that they were going to seek peace with Germany. And that becomes another sort of big issue which is going on because there's still a world war underway. And the United States, Britain, France, Italy, some other countries are all at that point still very much involved in that war, which is, not really going all that well for them at that point, particularly with Russia leaving it. And so there was whole feeling sort of betrayal by Russia, and that were the Bolsheviks actually going to make peace with the Kaiser? And again, you can look at people like William Boyce Thompson, who would go to the press and go, "No, this will never happen. I know these guys. They're not going to make a separate peace." Well, they do. He's dead wrong. But that was a thing that was in itself was something which was debated within the Bolshevik camp. There was no absolute unanimity among the Lenin had basically decided that yes, we're going to make peace, and we're ultimately going to make peace on any terms we can get. But that wasn't a view that was shared by Trotsky. It wasn't a view that was shared by Stalin. He's not a very important guy at that point, but he didn't share it. It wasn't a view probably shared by most other in the Bolshevik hierarchy. And a lot of it just had to do with Lenin's force of personality being able to push that through. But if you actually look at the votes that are taken within the decisions to whether or not to accept the Brest-Litovsk treaty that the Germans put forward, which was a difficult pill to swallow. Again, Trotsky would simply, he would refuse to vote for it. He wouldn't put his name, wouldn't eventually put his foot down about it, but he would not support it. So it wasn't clear. And that sort of raised these questions in some people's minds. Let's say it goes back to what we were talking about before, how you can change the path of a government simply by changing one or two people in it. So if you began to look at things, if you were paying attention to how power seemed to be flowing in the Bolshevik camp, you would notice that this guy Lenin seemed to be the one who was calling all the shots. That he clearly dominated most of the other figures. But you might also notice that Trotsky seemed to be also quite popular and outspoken, influential, visibly ambitious, but also, clearly opposed to a separate peace with the Germans. He'd always made his opposition to a separate peace fairly clear, and also much more amenable to cooperation with agents of Allied governments. So you still have, and Trotsky talking in the spring of 1918 about the possibility at some point of maybe resuming the war against Germany. And so you might get the idea, or you could see how someone would get the idea that, if somehow this Lenin guy could just be, pushed aside one way or the other, then we might be able to deal with a more practical person like
Trotsky, could have been others as well. But we're going to see that Lenin was a sort of a dominating hardline figure. And if he could be eliminated, and that, of course, raises the interesting question, because if he could be, who would have taken his place? I mean, good, bad, or indifferent, he was the most influential person. And that if in some way historically you removed his influence at a critical period, then things could have happened very differently. So it's, again, I go back to this point that where I think Sutton was very correct. The thing he was correct that there was more going on that existed in the standard narrative. You know, that essentially that the Bolsheviks seized power, they were evil. Everybody in the West recognized this, and they all unified to, again, sort of smother the Soviet influence in his crib, as I'd love to say, but somehow failed to do that. And see, that's another thing that comes up. If all of these powerful countries were determined to do that, the question comes, how could you screw that up? I mean, how is it that you could, I mean, the Bolsheviks did not have a firm grasp on power. They had all kinds of very powerful internal opposition. There was a whole civil war they were fighting, and a civil war which Great Britain, more than anyone else, but also France and the United States to some degree, all financially and militarily backed. And yet that fails. And that's where someone could ask, I think that's where Sutton sort of got the idea. Did this fail because this was never really a genuine crusade to begin with? This was all sort of PR to cover the fact that that the only way that this could, that the power of the Allies could fail in this is if there were interests involved that really wanted the Bolsheviks to remain in power. But I think that the real thing that you have to appreciate in this, and in almost anything going on historically, is that so much of it is chaos. Mm-hmm. So all of the attempts by people to conspire, the purpose of conspiracies is to try to manage chaos, which you can never entirely do, which is why they will almost always fail for one reason or another.
Okay, I'll bring a question in there.
Yeah.
So in your work, most of the central characters seem to be acting from their own interpretation of benevolent reasons. Okay, so Jacob Schiff is trying to help out the downtrodden Jewish people in Tsarist Russia and trying to overthrow the Tsar for that reason, or supports overthrowing him. Charles Crane has this business interest, and the American business class generally say, oh, Russia's mismanaged and we need to get American markets in there rather than the Europeans. And then you have the Friends of Russia, with Mark Twain types in the United States and Emily Hothouse's brother in the UK, who are these real humanitarian types who want to build a better world. So there's this confluence of different forces there. And I found it very interesting what you were saying about the reaction to the aborted revolution attempt of 1905, and how I think it was in the American media that some people were calling for an invasion of Russia in a similar way to the Spanish-American War. They wanted a Russian-American war now to finish the job. And that I really didn't know that before coming across in your book. But just see if I'm characterizing the contrast between your position and Anthony Sutton's correctly there, that Sutton has this additional reason of this is a deliberate effort to kneecap the Russian economy, the Russian government. Russian growth in the economy for the first decade of the 20th century is dramatic. It's growing at 8 or 10% a year. Russia vastly has this incredible amount of natural resources, a greater population than the United States. And I did come across in like the writings of Theodore Roosevelt and such, this idea that the 20th century would be a competition between the Anglo-Saxon and the Slav for domination of the world and domination of Chinese markets and so on. So, and of course, let's say that Russia, there hadn't been the communist revolution and Russia had taken control of the Turkish Straits, expanded territory further into Poland, and had continued this exponential economic growth that had moved to something of a kind of market economy, and maybe the Tsar's power slowly declined over the 20th century. It would have been a real economic competitor to the United States then. You would have had a much more genuinely multipolar world. So I look at Sutton's claim and I go, well, yeah, you can't ignore that. It does kind of make sense. But are you not going along with that level of cynicism, that you don't think there was anyone in the US who had this long-term goal of, or in the UK for that matter, of actually like instigating a revolution and bringing in like the crazy communist, if you like, to cut Russia off at the knees?
Well, I think that it was, if you look at someone from the American standpoint, if you look at Charles Crane, and Crane envisioned, he wanted to see Tsarism gone from Russia. He wanted to see it become a kind of modern. But what he wanted to see it become is he wanted to see it become another version, a kind of Russianized version of America. All right, this was the, and you might argue this is one of those things that is I'm not sure it's peculiar to the sort of view much of the American elite, but that there's that certainly by the early 20th century, and people like Crane and elsewhere among the sort of American ruling class, for lack of a better term, they thought of themselves as the cutting edge of humanity at that point in time. And that in some way, the American Republic was the basic template that everything else was supposed to become. And therefore, if Russia was going to be democratized, it would be democratized as in a kind of American Republican form. And they were the kind of they would follow our lead in this case, that we would have the kind of influence. I think it was this, you see this come up again, after 1991, and Yeltsin's Russia is flooded with American political and economic advisors who thought they were, pretty much thought they were going to come in and turn the whole place into a giant McDonald's in 6 months through some sort of shock treatment economy, and that would work, and then it would just be sort of transformed, that attitudes and values would automatically come along with that. That usually doesn't work quite so easily, but I think there was a kind of messianic Americanism that influenced people like Crane, who felt that by getting rid of an atavistic regime like Tsarism, that they would be being Russia into the mainstream, and they would sort of fast track its Americanization, but that also would give a great deal of influence and clout. Russians would then sort of naturally look to Americans like Charles Crane as their leaders and the inspiration, and looking for them for all kinds of advice. And it's the one thing that certainly is correct, and I do mention this, is that Russia in the early 20th century was, I'd argue, by the time of the First World War, poised for a kind of economic takeoff. Well, it already was taking off. And it was also probably, aside from the British Empire, which controlled, still a quarter of the world's land area. The Russians had a sixth. The Americans didn't have that much, but they have a very large sort of continental base. There were the sort of two. I think there was the kind of recognition that the early beginning of 20th century that the British Empire's days as hegemon were not over, but you could see that down the road. Everyone could see that. I mean, if you basically looked at the economic statistics, you could see that Britain was steadily losing ground from the late 19th century against Germany, but more than Germany, against the US. This is one of the things that once surprised me, is if you actually look as to who British industry was losing markets to. Well, they were losing markets to the Germans, but they were losing more markets to the Americans. They were really in the long run the more serious and dangerous competitor. And then way out in sort of left field, to bring in a baseball analogy, you've got Russia, which is still far behind. But the thing about Russia is that it's just got so much resources, potentially. It had all this gigantic potential. And that's one of the things that frustrated businessmen like Crane, is that they simply argued that Tsarism was too backward of a regime to exploit all of that potential. There's all of this stuff, there's all this tungsten in Siberia we get a hold of, but these people are just too backward in order to build trains to get to there. And so what they really need is, sort of American advice and know-how and energy that we brought in. Russia under American guidance was what Crane wanted. And you can then argue, what's the difference between guidance and control? Well, a matter of perspective. But I think that what Sutton was arguing is that there was a deliberate plan to sort of kneecap the Russian economy, to hold them back by instituting chaos. Whereas I think it was more about the idea of trying to guide this potential rival into a position of dependency upon one or the other existing states. And if you look around, during the First World War, that's also essentially what the British and the Germans are trying to do. You know, part of the whole Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, that had a whole addendum of economic items that essentially would have turned Russia into a kind of German economic colony, which was what they wanted. In other words, to get control of those. In other words, getting control of the resources through business acquisition, by putting in a friendly, dependent regime. I think that's what they were being aimed for, was to try to gain control in some degree. You know, one of the British attempts at this in 1918 was this kind of half-baked plan of going in and buying up all the stocks in Russian banks, the so-called the banking scheme. And because, you know, the banks had been nationalized, and you could, you know, find emigres that would sell you their shares at a small amount. But the assumption was that, you know, if at some point these pesky Bolsheviks change their mind, you know, if they change their policies, or if they're overthrown, if either of those happen, then look, we own all the bank stocks in the country, and these banks also own much of the industry. And then you've got Americans like Hoover and others who are constantly trying to get concessions in mining. This was, you know, to get control of the resources. And then it becomes this kind of factional battle as to how to do that. And someone could argue that the Bolsheviks were an obstacle, you know, because they're communists and anti-capitalists and opposed to development as we see it. They're an obstacle, but someone else, you know, William Boyce Thompson, can look at that and goes, oh no, these people are essentially idealists, but they have to be fairly practical men in some way. And so what they simply need to do is they'll take our advice out of necessity, and we will sort of gain a position of dominance within that economy. But again, if you go back to the war itself, the whole German policy really was towards trying to turn Russia into a post-war economic colony. Britain essentially wanted the same thing. America envisioned a Russia that was, you know, would sit at America's lap and do what it was told.
Okay, and that's so when Anthony Sutton is talking about American troops supporting the Bolsheviks in Siberia and Vladivostok, you are writing about the figure of John F. Stevens and bringing 300 men into Russia to take over the railways, essentially, and the Bolsheviks initially having opposition to that, but then going along with it. So do you think are you proposing that the reason for this support that Sutton is identifying is because the Bolsheviks struck up a deal, essentially, with American companies to take control of things like the railways, so they became what seemed like a good bet?
Well, I think the deal for the railways was done before the Bolsheviks come into power.
Oh, okay.
So the Bolsheviks inherit everything that the Kerensky, the provisional regime, had done before them. And I mean, that's, you know, again, I keep going back to William Boyce Thompson, but, you know, as an example of what was later a pro-Bolshevik American businessman. Well, when he shows up during the provisional regime, he's all for Kerensky and the provisional government. And at one point, he gives $1 million of his own money, or I don't know, his stockholders' money. He gives $1 million to the Kerensky government to combat enemy propaganda, which meant then combating Bolshevik propaganda, which at that point, in August 1917, is considered to be German finance propaganda, which, you know, it was. So, but then when Kerensky falls and Lenin's in charge, Thompson just kind of seamlessly changes his tune and leaves the bulk of that money with them, now to continue to generate revolutionary propaganda to be disseminated among German troops. I mean, when I look at Thompson, is that here's a guy who just wants to, you know, he wants to do business by any means possible, and he'll assume whatever sort, you know. So he'll back Kerensky against Lenin, except when Kerensky's a dead letter and Lenin's in power. So we'll make a deal with Lenin. We'll negotiate a deal. And here's I think a point that's important about this is that understanding these are, after all, businessmen. And one of the things that a Thompson or a Crane or a Jacob Schiff, anyone had learned in their years of doing business successfully is you don't have to like the people you do business with. It's absolutely unessential that they are friends of yours. In fact, it's probably better that they're not, because that then doesn't let personal sentiment get in the way of business. You do business with someone because there is mutual advantage to it. That's the only actual reason. And therefore, you can make business deals with people that you personally despise. You can despise everything about them, their lifestyle, their habits, the way they eat, the way they come there. It doesn't matter. You can hate everything about them. But nevertheless, if it is financially advantageous to be in business with them, that you'll do that. So doing business with the Bolsheviks doesn't require that you have any sympathy with them. It doesn't mean that you don't fundamentally hate everything that they stand for. But the point is, as Henry Ford might say, they want tractors and I make tractors and they will pay me for the tractors in gold. That is good business. How things work out politically down the end, we'll see. And both sides could kind of justify their position. I mean, Lenin can justify his position by, I think the paraphrase statement is that, in the end, we'll sell the ropes to the capitalists that we'll then use to hang them with. Okay, because that's what it is they do. And on the other hand, was the idea was that this whole crazy communist thing can't possibly persist. They will either be overthrown and someone else replace them. All right. And you can bet that had Admiral Kolchak or one of the white generals seized control of Moscow and toppled the Bolsheviks, that William Boyce Thompson would have been right there singing their praises and offering the same deal that he had before. So businessmen are used to dealing with people that you don't necessarily like. And in fact, you may hate or mistrust to some degree, but where there is profit to be made, profit will be made. The other thing that I think influenced this is that a lot of American businessmen it wasn't like they had never heard of socialism before. All right, so there was an American Socialist Party, which was, fairly influential among the American working class around the time of the First World War, and which Wilson regime used the war as a means to substantially suppress. Socialist Party never recovered from the wartime repression that happened after 1917. But businessmen had dealt with this. They dealt with labor unions. They dealt with radical workers and these kinds of demands. And what was the one thing that they had learned from this is, well, they could all be dealt with, right? Strikes could be broken. Labor unions could be subverted, or they could be brought under, you don't like the union that exists, pay to have another one created.
Okay.
But I think there was the sense that they could manage this type of thing. I mean, these are all this bunch of wild radicals. Well, we've had wild radicals before. They're all impractical people, and once they're in power, they'll have to become practical.
And that's the reason for, just taking the example from your book, the US blocks this transfer of 40,000 soldiers to the Far East to reinforce the Vladivostok Whites. And they tell the Japanese to back off then, because they consider Trotsky is a man they can potentially work with. So he's a good horse to back at that point.
There is there's a lot about the whole Trotsky story, which is, I think, may never be known. It probably isn't supposed to be. But there's a lot of there, which is going on. And it's one of those things that is not very palatable to a lot of people. I was surprised when I first tried to work on fleshing out what Trotsky was doing during his 3 months in America, what was actually going on. And I knew a few people who were, sort of very sort of Trotsky scholars in some way. This was the whole, but beyond that, they also were sort of Trotsky fanboys. Can use that. They were Trotskyites, or they imagined that they were. um, whatever particularly that means in a modern context. But they were completely uninterested in it. There was no real, I found the same thing in simply trying to look into his genealogy. It was as if none of these people had any real interest. I mean, it wasn't just that they didn't know anything about it, they didn't want to know anything about it. And they would argue that it was completely irrelevant as to whether or not Trotsky was related to the Zhivatovsky brothers, who are these very wealthy Russian bankers and capitalists. He has this whole set of capitalist uncles. And that, doesn't make any difference. I mean, what did it mean that when, that the first message that Trotsky sends when he lands in Norway on his way back to Russia finally from America, that the first person he informs of his imminent arrival are not any of his revolutionary colleagues. No, it's his uncle Abram Zhivatovsky, capitalist. Now, is that just because it was a family thing, or why that particular person? But to people I would try to talk to this about, they would argue that, well, that just doesn't mean anything. Okay, it doesn't mean because the only thing you have to do is you just have to look at what Trotsky writes in his political writings, and that's the only thing that's real. And their basic view is that if he didn't mention it, it's not important, and therefore I should not try to draw attention to it. Whereas to me, unhealthily curious about these things that I am, I want to know what the relationship was between he and his uncle, because clearly there was one. And again, from very different perspectives, they nevertheless and this, maybe this is also something else that I think that often gets underrated in historical narrative, is relationship, family. It's sometimes treated as if that's kind of immaterial in some ways. I think it's never immaterial. Family either unites people or divides them in some way. And so finding out that so-and-so is someone's brother or their cousin, or there is a familiar relationship between them, should never be ignored, because that becomes very important in human affairs.
Okay, if I can ask about Trotsky then and his movement back into Russia, which seems to be facilitated by the British. So I'd like to put to you the way this is being interpreted in some of the more alternative or conspiracy kind of based revisionisms of this history. Okay, so one narrative that intrigued me, okay, and I find both very compelling and utterly implausible, is the idea that, well, Britain throughout the 19th century, the major geopolitical concern of Russia, obviously there's the Khyber Pass and India, but the naval concern is the Turkish Straits. So Britain essentially went to war in the 1850s to prevent Russia gaining control of the Turkish Straits. There was nearly a war again in the 1880s. And then suddenly there's a reversal where, as far as I understand it, Russia's major war aim for the First World War, they thought they'd get out of it, was control of the Turkish Straits, because when they closed, it really cut off Russian exports and they couldn't move their military ships through them. And there are certain more conspiratorial narratives that see it as just completely implausible that Britain would give up the Turkish Straits and allow Russia to become a great naval power. This is completely out of their interest. So the way Trotsky's movement is interpreted then is he's going back there to bring about this Bolshevik revolution, precisely so at the right moment when the Americans are involved, Russia can withdraw from the war and then they won't get a seat at the table of negotiations and they won't win over the Turkish Straits. Now, I find that kind of highly compelling and utterly implausible at the same time, because there's just too many moving pieces there to possibly fit into place. But what I understand from your work is that Trotsky, at the time he was in New York, was not talking about withdrawing Russia from the war, and therefore would not have been seen as a threat that way. He could have been a very useful revolutionary figure in terms of keeping Russia in the war.
Yes, I think that's, well, you go back to something like, the British agreement with Russia. It's like all of the wartime treaties that are made. Okay, it's kind of this process of diplomatic seduction. So what's happened in 1914 is that through a set of circumstances, Britain France, and Russia are now all allied against Germany. Now, remember, a couple of decades before, Russia was the big enemy and Germany wasn't. So things can, all of this is subject to change. So it simply means that now, because the Russians are allies, you have to make them happy, and you have to give them, we have to agree how we're going to divide things up. So, yeah, promise them the Turkish Straits. Now, if you compare that to other wartime treaties, compare it like the entry of Italy into the war, the secret Treaty of London. It's secret because no one's supposed to know about it. And the Italians get promised various things around the Adriatic that, guess what? Even though the war is won, come peacemaking in 1919, the Italians immediately get miffed because the British and French, who had promised these things before, now argue that, that's probably not such a good idea because now we have to accommodate Yugoslavia, which is this thing we've created. So you can't, the deal we made before, well, that was then, this is now. So that's one of the things to understand about wartime diplomatic agreements. It's like they'll agree to whatever you want now, because this is now, and then later on we'll see how this works out. I also don't quite buy the idea that Trotsky went back just to try to help screw up the whole Straits deal, because you could have done that on your own. That would have been what it all depended on was who ended up in physical possession of the Straits at the war's end. That's what it depended upon.
You do think it's quite plausible that Britain would have reneged on that they would have found a way to wiggle out of that, or not given the Russians?
They would have, any way they possibly could have.
Right.
They would have taken physical possession of the Straits as they actually did, and then it would have taken another war probably to get them out of it, and there would have been a whole, and plus there's all the matter. The other thing is that loan the Russians all kinds of money, okay, get them in debt. So they can just trade that. Well, the whole Straits thing, well, you owe us, a lot of money, so maybe we can make a deal on that as well. No, it was never a deal that was made with any intention of ever actually following through on it, if there was any way you could possibly avoid it. So yeah, one of the things about Trotsky is that he gave an interview to the New York Times shortly before he returned in March of 1917. And in that, he's very clear about saying is that he does not support the idea of Russia taking a separate peace. Now, he's very much opposed to the war. As a good anti-war socialist, he is opposed to the war, which of course is a capitalist and imperialist war. But his argument, and not a sensible one, is that Russia couldn't really have a separate peace. It has to be part of a generalized peace. So Russia's peace will come when the war ends, but having a separate peace would not be practical because it would leave Russia isolated and rather vulnerable in that position. And that's why, to me, this was simply, looking at the relationship. The fellow who's the head of British intelligence in New York in this period is a guy named Sir William Wiseman. Interesting guy in a lot of ways. A banker, by the way, by profession. So he knows his way around Wall Street quite well. But what he was looking for, in fact, he sets up with the knowledge of his superiors in London out of New York right about the same time, beginning in the spring of 1917, as after the Tsar is overthrown and things are getting kind of weird in Russia. His whole proposal, which he draws up, is a plan to guide the storm. In other words, kind of control the narrative which is taking place in Russia. And that included picking various revolutionary figures, people from different ethnic groups, like the Czechs, the Poles, the Lithuanians, and sending them back through America. So there didn't appear to be any particular British hand on this. Coming back into Russia, and then influencing the course of politics in the right direction, which meant keeping Russia in the war against Germany. And Trotsky was everything that Wiseman was looking for. And then you find these things, that when Trotsky goes, he had to get He had to get a passport, or he actually had to get a kind of, pass to go, because the British controlled everybody leaving New York and headed towards Europe. You had to go through inspection in Halifax and elsewhere. And if they didn't want you going, you didn't go. So, see, that was the whole key. The key to Trotsky getting back to Russia wasn't an American passport he didn't need. He had a Russian passport, which he went and got, or at least a kind of version of a passport, which he got from the new provisional government, because their whole policy was ali ali oxen free. Everybody could come back. All exiles were welcome to return. And so all he had to do was go to the Russian consulate in New York, and however reluctantly, the former czarist official would stamp a piece of paper saying that he was a Russian citizen and could return to the country. But then he had to get to the pass from the British, and he goes to the British consulate at 44 Whitehall. He goes to the Passport Control Office, which is managed by, completely overseen by Wiseman's intelligence, what would later become MI6, what is SIS, Secret Intelligence Service, what was then called MI1C. Anyway, all these acronyms. But the point is that the whole passport control operation at the British consulate is directly controlled by Wiseman's section. So there's no way they didn't know Trotsky came. And Trotsky himself notes in his memoirs that the British couldn't have been more helpful. Okay, they had no problem. They knew who he was. His revolutionary background had been widely discussed in the American press. He wasn't shy about his public pronouncements. And they had no problem, or at least Wiseman had no problem with him returning. And eventually Trotsky does end up in this glitch when he, when the ship he's on, the Christiania Fjord, gets stopped in Halifax. He's taken off by British authorities because he's a suspected German agent. But this is because of, it all has to do with the kind of division in British intelligence in New York. And that has to do with the fact that Wiseman had a rival who was the fellow who represented British naval intelligence, who was Guy Gaunt. And I don't want to go too far into this story, but it was essentially Gaunt trying to screw with Wiseman, who he considered to be his public enemy. And then, but eventually, Trotsky is out and he goes back. But this was Wiseman was one of the first to see that Trotsky is a guy that could be useful. He does not support a separate peace. He doesn't really appear to be, he'd probably take money from the Germans, but the point is he'll take money from anybody. Okay, he's perfectly, and from Trotsky's standpoint, look, he knows that he's not going to get back to Russia and without the British cooperating. Doesn't matter what the Americans do. The Americans don't control whether he's going to leave the country, but the British can essentially keep him bottled up in New York. So, I don't think any particular promises were made, but help was offered and it was accepted, and a kind of tacit relationship, a kind of dialogue was approached. So to me, then, it's no mystery that when you go ahead another year, and now it's the spring of 1918, and Trotsky is the People's Commissar for War, and you have people like Lockhart and Riley going there, it all centers around Trotsky. That's the guy they're constantly trying to groom and pay attention to, because he's the one that fundamentally some people think ought to be the fellow in power. And he's quite helpful.
So that kind of brings us on to the Lockhart plot, really, and this character of Sidney Riley. Do you think that was a genuine effort at an assassination of Lenin then to bring someone like Trotsky into power?
What I suspect, okay, and I can only say I suspect because I'm not going to say I absolutely, someone asked me not too long ago what it was I believed, and I said, well, I don't really believe anything. Okay, in the sense that I don't take things as some sort of operative example. I think that everything exists as a range of possibilities, and some of those possibilities are more likely than others. And what everything suggests to me is what I mentioned before about there being more to the whole Trotsky saga that we know, and I think it's very unpalatable to his fans because it paints him as something of a egotistical mercenary. egotistical. I don't think there could be any argument about how mercenary he was. Well, I think Trotsky was ambitious, and he was, I experienced conspirator, if nothing else, and he'd make whatever deals he needed to make in order to accomplish his ends. And if his ends was to get back into Russia, he would make a deal to accomplish that. If his end was to try to expand his influence within the Bolshevik hierarchy, he'd do what he wanted to do there. So it was, I think, what was going on in the summer of 1918. And this involves both the attempted assassination of Lenin at the end of August and in the so-called Lockhart plot that was going on at the same time, is that what was going on was a primarily British, although not necessarily exclusively British, effort to change the leadership in the Bolshevik hierarchy, which meant replacing Lenin with Trotsky. And that, again, because of the law of unintended consequences, did not work out the way that it was intended to, or at least it doesn't seem to have worked out that way. And again, it makes perfect sense as to why you would rather, it makes sense as to why you would assume if we could get rid of Lenin and put in a more amenable, maybe just more vain and manipulable character like Trotsky, that this would be advantageous for our immediate ends. Remember, what people are generally thinking of is not what we need 10 years from now, what we need right now. All right. And what you needed right now in 1918 was you needed, above all, Russia back into the war against Germany. So, see, that's one of the things that would, assuming that's correct, and the whole idea that the effort was to prevent because if that happened, we might assume that had somehow Trotsky or someone moved the Soviet regime back into the Allied camp before the armistice at the end of the war, then Russia would have been better positioned to push through. What would have happened to those claims to the Straits, for instance? What would have been the payoff in that? So I don't think the Straits were a major consideration. I think the consideration of them was to try to return Russia to the fold in order to bring the war to a successful conclusion, and that was seen as a way to achieve it. It failed, and I'll tell you the primary reason it failed. For years, I tried to make sense of the whole Lockhart thing, and there was and again, this was going by the standard narrative. And the standard narrative is that Riley is essentially trying to organize the overthrow of the Bolshevik regime per se. Now, this is the whole thing, that he's trying to topple the regime, and that he is working with at least the tacit support of the British government and also with other allied representatives, the French, and then above all, an American, the head of American intelligence, a very unlikely name of Xenophon Calamatiano. And it was Calamatiano, by the way, is the only one of the Allied representatives in Russia in this period who's actually arrested, tried, and convicted for his part in the 1918 conspiracies. And spends the next 3 years in a Soviet prison and eventually gets out. And he was actually looking into Calamatiano, but the first inklings that there might be something else to this, where Calamatiano was always adamant, never wavered for a second, that the guy who was responsible for his arrest, the fellow who was the whole worm in the bud of the so-called Lockhart plot, was Riley. Calamatiano believed that Riley was working with the Bolsheviks, not against them, and that his whole purpose in this was to guide this so-called anti-Soviet plot onto the rocks, that was his whole plan to begin with. Now, Kalamata had to blame somebody for what happened to him, but he was quite clear, I think, and it was these things um, never made any particular sense. One of the most intriguing statements that Kalamata made, which never explains any further than this, and at some point, again, Kalamata is a businessman. He's a representative for a large American manufacturing consortium. He previously represented farm machinery. I think Allis Chalmers at one point, International Harvester, he'd been a representative. So he too is a kind of Wall Street figure. And at some point he goes, I checked with people in New York. I asked people in New York about Riley, which is where Riley had been doing business for most of the First World War, was in New York. And they told me that he was a professional. Now he never says who they are or exactly what they told him, but it's interesting is that Kalamata checked with mutual acquaintances in New York, mostly in the business community, about Riley, was told essentially that this guy is a professional, he knows what he's doing, and from that, Kalamata can never figure out how a supposed professional could screw up that badly unless what we think is the screw up was exactly what it was that he was trying to do. So that got me thinking. Eventually it came down to the thing that sometimes you're trying to build this story, and I kept trying to make the standard anti-Bolshevik Riley and Lockhart as this kind of unwilling sidekick thing work in this case. And eventually the whole thing is that, well, let's try it another way. Let's take the same set of events, but let's make Riley acting in Bolshevik interests the whole time. And then everything fell together. So am I in some way in that being seduced by my own? I mean, I don't necessarily want that to happen. I think it's interesting that it did. But to me, that's the version that makes the most sense, is that he's never what it is that he appears to be. That kind of goes, that's just part and parcel for this guy. But there's someone who I think, what I couldn't tell you at this point is whether I'm convinced, whether I think that I can tell you what I'm quite certain that Riley did, is that he worked almost consistently for Soviet or some aspect of Soviet interests from 1918 on, that he was always essentially acting primarily in that role. And that therefore his generally much more visible role as a kind of fire-breathing anti-Bolshevik crusader backed by British intelligence was the fiction in this case. That's what it was that he was pretending to be, but that he was pretending to be that. Go to this fact. Name me any kind of anti-Soviet conspiracy that Riley had anything to do with that succeeded. The answer is none of them do. In the same way that his whole friendship of Savinkov, who was at one point a somewhat formidable figure in the anti-Bolshevik camp, but everything that Savinkov does with Riley just leads, what does Savinkov's relationship with Riley culminate in? It culminates in Savinkov going back to Moscow, giving himself up and ratting everybody out. And he's encouraged to do that by Riley. That's what the whole purpose of this was. The whole friendship was to guide him in that direction. So there you go.
Okay, I have one further question on this particular period of history, if that's okay. And
sure.
So in part, it's about, well, really, let's start with this. I don't really think, certainly in this part of the world, you hear much about the Polish-Soviet war running on to 1920. We have a very defined idea of the World War I being 1914 to 1918, and then everyone goes back to normal. But it really seems it came close that the Soviets were going to overrun Poland and take the whole territory at that point, right up to the German border, and then had ambitions beyond that, for obviously for the spread of communism. This is the point where there's a Red Scare going on in the United States. There's lots of bombs going off. Some people say that's kind of overhyped, and it's a way of the capitalist class suppressing the labor movement. I'm sure that's true. Other people think it's a very serious thing of Soviet infiltration. But what kind of do you know what kind of concern there was amongst the Allies at that time, or the old Allies of Britain, America, France, for this expansion of Russia through Poland during 1920?
Well, if you go back to the summer of 1920, particularly in the sort of critical months of July and August, the new Polish army had basically taken advantage of the Russian Civil War, all the infighting, to expand fairly far to the east. This is the type of thing where anybody can go back and sort of look at the maps. But at one point in early 1920, the Poles actually march into Western Ukraine and occupy Kiev. Okay. And they do that by making a deal with the Ukrainian nationalist movement that a few months before they'd been bitter enemies of, because there's this whole contest. I mean, the Poland that many Poles, including Pilsudski and others, envisioned included large amounts of what the Ukrainians considered to be Ukraine. It's an ongoing problem, isn't it? But here again, you have this. You have a perfect example of a convenient wartime alliance. Right, so the Ukrainians under Petlura had been completely beaten by the Bolsheviks. They're not big enough to put up any significant fight, but if they link themselves to the Poles, maybe they can get something out of it. And the Poles will extract a gigantic pound of flesh in terms of territory for their help, but nevertheless, it's either one side or the other. And in the case of the Poles, they need the Ukrainians on their side as opposed to being against them, as making some sort of deal with the Reds. So the Soviet counteroffensive sort of begins after the Poles take Kiev. They had pretty much won the Civil War in the meantime, and by August they're advancing on Warsaw. And so the climactic event in this is, of course, the Battle of Warsaw, which in modern Polish history is, a virtual religious event. This is, and for a good reason, because had Warsaw fallen, probably the short-lived, by that time, Polish Second Republic would have fallen with it. So the threat of a Polish military collapse in the summer of 1920 was real. And what prevented that was that the Red Army, the Soviet Red Army, overextended itself. It marched too fast, too far, with insufficient forces, and so it reached the gates of Warsaw exhausted. The Poles, were pushed back on their sources of supply and were able to rebuild. They also, the biggest help to them, by the way, came from the French. The French sent in an entire military mission, sent weapons, tanks, etc. British support for the Poles always seemed to be a little squishier. I mean, but the French were the mainstay in this case. And the Americans, not to be left out, there was a whole Polish volunteer squadron of American flyers, kind of mercenaries, but also, more pro-Polish than anything else, who were present as well. And the people who were watching all of this more closely, of course, were the Germans. And, the First World War had not gone Germany's way. And I think it's fair to say that there were a lot of people in the Reich who were quite unhappy with the Treaty of Versailles and everything that had been entailed, and quite unhappy with the creation of a new Poland. And once again, it was one of the things that the Germans, even the most monarchist, monocle-wearing Prussian Junker, whatever else they thought of the Russians or the Bolsheviks, could agree with them that Poland needed to be wiped off the face of the earth. And that they would have been, I remember a statement, I can't remember the guy's name, but it was again from a very, very traditional, very much a Junker officer, or a former officer in the German army, who argued that, and the question was, is that if Warsaw falls, is the Red Army going to stop when it reaches the German border? well, the commander of the Red Army, Tukhachevsky, had already said no. He'd given an interview where, maybe he was boasting a little bit. When he asked what the goal of his campaign was, he goes, "I aim to water my horses on the Rhine." So, once reactionary Poland is defeated, once the bourgeois Polish state is crushed, then we will press on westward and reach unity. And Germany was the country that even more than Russia, has the biggest communist party in the world. The KPD is there. It's already tried to seize power once. It's just kind of waiting. Much of the German population is demoralized. And here again, you have this kind of right-wing officer who you might assume to be the best example of an anti-communist, who says that, look, if the Bolsheviks show up on our border, I will change the imperial eagle on my cap for the red star, and I'll do it gladly because it will give us the chance to march again against the British and French. We'll be able to resume the war. So if I have to make, despite whatever I personally believe, if in order to exact revenge against our enemies, who have forced this horrible treaty on us, in order to overturn the stain of Versailles, that I'll put on a red star and I'll join forces with the Soviets, and then we'll sort things out later. That's how that goes. So the idea there was quite real, and it's one of those. I think that the Battle of Warsaw is one of the truly a very important turning point. It could have gone very differently. And had the Red Army showed up on the German border in the summer of 1920 with the defeated Poland behind it, I don't know what would have happened, except that what happened from that point on would have been different than the history that we know now.
And substantially enough that it's not at all inconceivable that the First World War might have just resumed 2 years later, essentially, with a different alliance setup.
With a different, a lot of it would have to do with, the goal, certainly from the Soviet standpoint, would be the establishment of a communist regime in Germany. And yet there were, and whether or not that would bring in, whether you could, whether the German communists could successfully put together a regime, whether they could actually establish themselves in power and then mobilize the country to resume the war in alliance with Soviet Russia, but now in the term of a class war as opposed to a war, an imperial war. I don't know. Would the German populace have rallied to that cause? Some would have, but would it have been enough? That's again I don't know. You would just have to try and see. But it was a real. It certainly would have created. With the French, for instance, and I think that would they have preemptively, pushed across the Rhine and tried to occupy as much of Germany as they could before that happened. So that was one. I think it was Foch who said something. Well, if it looks like the Germans are going to go red, then what we need to do is just immediately seize Berlin as quickly as possible. We shouldn't basically wait around for Tukhachevsky and his Cossacks to show up on the Rhine, but we should preempt this by essentially meeting them in Germany. Or would have led to a war between a semi-communist Germany, the Red Army, the British, and the French. But then there again, you get into this question: is that whether or not Britain would have joined France in that crusade? I don't know, because see, they weren't getting along that well at that time. Think of it this way: consider all of the history. Let's just go back to Joan of Arc, right? Which the French have never forgotten or forgiven. And France and Britain were allies against Germany because a particular set of circumstances put them together as allies. But that never entailed any deep love or trust between the two. The French, after the war, immediately began accusing the British of trying to undercut them in the Middle East, of subsidizing rebellions in Syria against them, in which they were quite correct. That's exactly what they were doing. Because now, again, the situation had changed. That was then, this is now. So, having broken up the Ottoman Empire, you know, the British Empire basically wanted all the best pieces for itself, and they sort of reluctantly let the French have Syria, but then pretty much did everything they could to try to undercut that as much as possible, because at that point, French geopolitical interests in the Middle East were contrary to British geopolitical interests.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That's my entire list of questions. Is there anything else that you think is important to mention?
Oh, well, there's probably all kinds of things that are.
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't want to say it's my entire list. I've got
Um,
piles more, but I think it's good
it's
segment.
well, I guess I'd go back, to this thing that I've probably harped on enough in this case about history being a narrative, and it's a narrative often shaped by the views or the prejudices or assumptions of the people writing it. And, I don't claim to be absolutely immune from that, although I will say that I've never really gone into any of my projects with some preconceived notion of what I wanted to find. I try to look at it, I try to let things simply reveal themselves. And I do believe that if you go, again, it's like saying that if you want to know what it was that what people on Wall Street thought about the Bolsheviks, go read what they were saying in the newspapers at the time. These guys were often quite willing to shoot off their mouths with political opinions. And you will find people who will argue that Bolshevism is a great danger, it must be suppressed, and we can never deal with them. And you will find others who will argue that no, it's actually kind of reasonable. It's actually idealism in political form, and we can do business with them. And then you probably got a larger third out there who are people who would never say much of anything, but would do business as long as it was conceivably profitable for them. So it's I'd basically say that what people should always keep aware of is that the predominant element in history is always chaos. We always think we're trying to control what's going on, and it's a bit like humans have all these kind of conceits. It's a bit like climate. All right, I don't want to get into the whole origins of what
Hmm.
climate is, but I say that climate does change. It inevitably, whatever the reasons for it, it always changes. Used to be an ice age. Now there isn't an ice age. So there's micro and many things. But the human conceit is that we can control this. We'll do a series of things. We'll do this, that, or the other things. We'll stop using this. We'll start using that. And we will be able to control climate. We'll be able to control this whole kind of natural process. My personal argument is that it is a gigantic conceit because you don't really know what it is that you're trying to control. But, good luck. But they're always sort of approaching this idea that there has to be someone in control. And I think that often where conspiracy theorists go awry in their conspiracy theorizing isn't that theorizing that conspiracies exist. They most certainly do. But often, again, giving them too much credit for being too well organized and having these things in control. To me, the spooky thing isn't that there are groups of people out there that think they could rule the world, that they ever actually would, but that they think they could. I mean, just imagine the chaos and potential damage that anybody who thinks that they have the keys to ruling the world can do. I'll just give you one example, the 1,000-Year Reich. How did that work out? All right. Okay, the grand Nazi conspiracy and its great was an utter fiasco. I mean, they eked 12 years out of this, but look at all the damage that was done by people who were convinced that they had the keys to reality. And that's where the real danger in these type of things lie. But history is a narrative. If you try to approach it, don't try to. Once you set your mind that this is the narrative, then that's the narrative that you'll write. Instead, try as much as you can to restrain your interest and not force things and just let the story tell itself. And generally, if you collect enough information, it will. And then the main thing to guide by is, okay, what in all of this simply makes sense? And usually that will be pretty apparent.
Thank you very much, Professor Spence. Would you like to mention your books, the various ones that are available on Audible and elsewhere?
Well, let's get into shameless self-promotion. So on Amazon or any place where books are available, my first book that I mentioned, the biography of Boris Stefankov, is alas long, long, long out of print from a defunct academic press. So good luck finding any chances of that. But if you're interested, I have been told that there are pirated versions available on the web, so you'll have to find those on your own. And because I never made a penny off of it, that's okay with me. But that again is Boris Stefankov, Renegade on the Left. My other main books are Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley, which goes into him and lots of people around him. Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult, which is by far the work that I seem to be best known for. Who knows? And then Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, 1905 to 1925. And many articles, which can be found in publications from Revolutionary Russia, to that journal, to New Dawn, a more popular one. But I've written a whole variety of figures. So if you're interested in Basil Zaharoff or Ignatius Trebitsch Lincoln, I've done some research into those fellows as well. Most recently, though, since I retired, I have been doing video projects. So I would point out that for an outfit called The Great Courses, also known as Wondrium, Wondrium, Great Courses, Wondrium, I have 3 programs available. These are video episodes. One is The Real History of Secret Societies. The other is Crimes of the Century, which deals with things like the murder of Trotsky in Mexico, among other historical homicides. And then most recently, Secrets of the Occult, okay, which manages to mention Aleister Crowley in every single of the 24 episodes. So there we go. And hopefully I'll be working on some more things along those lines as well. But that's my stuff. So if anybody's interested, there's where you can find it, Amazon or Great Courses Wondrium.
Okay, well, I better head off and say thank you very much indeed for your time. Okay. I'd love to talk again sometime if you're up for that.
Oh, I certainly would. Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Okay. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, you have a great day on the Isle of Man, and hopefully I'll talk to you soon.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.